This is the first of our podcasts. This is Unit 1, the Enlightenment. And we're going to start with Chapter 6, Section 1, and just go over some main ideas today. The first thing that we talked about today in class was the idea of light as a symbol of the Enlightenment. And we spoke of how it was definitely a very good symbol of this time period where people were beginning to kind of awake to their own ideas and really take on more of a role in their own lives in society. And we said it really started with the scientific revolution, and then it really took off and more people's role in society beginning the Enlightenment. And we did journal number 1. We talked a little before about most people prior to 1500 didn't really have much of a say in their own lives. They were controlled by higher authority or the church and didn't question those ideas that were passed on as to be truths in science and religion and so on. And we said this is a time period when people begin to question those things. And many of the changes that took place then still affect us today. The view of the universe prior to the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, was this geocentric theory. And this is the geo meaning earth, so earth-centered theory. And this had been passed down for centuries. This had been the belief of the church and was not challenged. But something would change during the scientific revolution, and that would be people's willingness to question and to observe. And we said people were taking on more of a role in their own learning. And what allowed people to make those changes at this time? There's 4 big ideas that I want you to take from that. The first one is that people were learning different ways of doing things from different countries, from ancient scholars, and finding out there were other beliefs about how the world worked and medicine and so on. And so they were beginning to take that and see how they could apply it to their own society. The second was the exploration of that time period. People were able to see new plants, new animals, new ideas, new ways of living, and that also, gave them ideas about what they could do in their own society. The third one is the most important, and that is the invention of the printing press. The printing press allowed for information to spread. Even though we saw that most people weren't educated and have the ability to read and write, those that did now could pass along that information. And we said how important that books will be and pamphlets will be during the Enlightenment. And the last one would be the need for improvement. So exploration showed that there were the need to find tools to travel, to explore, and this led the way for new inventions and innovations in the Enlightenment. Now, the heliocentric theory really had been out for much longer than during this Enlightenment period, but had not been accepted by the church and by others. And there's going to be 4 people we're going to look at during the 15 and 1600s who helped promote this theory. The first one is Copernicus. And Copernicus helped to further develop the heliocentric theory by studying the planets. And he tried to show that he found the planets revolved around the sun, opposed to this geocentric theory. He couldn't explain why they moved around the way that they did. He knew it would be very difficult to get his information out there, and it was a challenge to the church at the time. And in fact, he didn't have his information published until right before his death. But others built upon his work, and the first one is Tycho Brahe. Tycho was able to record the movements of the planets, and he used that data to really show how the planets could move around the sun and make sense of it. Now, Johannes Kepler was his assistant and worked with him, and he was a mathematician. Kepler was able to put the math behind the movement of the planets, how the planets revolved around the sun in elliptical orbits. Everyone thought that it had moved in circles, so this was something new and interesting for people to discover. And then finally, Galileo. And we said Galileo definitely did not have an easy time promoting his theory, but what he did to further establish the heliocentric theory was that he was able to build this telescope where he could actually observe how the planets moved. Jupiter, the Earth's moon, how it looked. So he was able to really take this a step further, but it did get him in trouble, we said, with the church at the time. Now, the belief in, that they could discover how the world worked for themselves led to the growth of the scientific method. And that's something I know we all use in our science classes and even our social science classes. The scientific method is just a way to go out and gather and test information, and it's a way that is controlled. And it was developed by 2 different scientists. The first one was a British scientist named Francis Bacon. And he urged those that were experimenting to observe. He thought that we just accepted too much without going out and observing on our own and finding out our own truths. The next scientist to further support this was René Descartes. Now, Descartes was a little bit different than Bacon. This French scientist believed that, yes, it was important to experiment and observe, but he also thought that you could rely on mathematics and logic and incorporate that with your studies. And one of his most famous quotes is, "I think, therefore I am," meaning the only thing that he knew was that he was. He didn't know how anything else really worked, and his goal was to go out and observe and figure it out. Now, someone that we also will talk about as being very important to this time period is Isaac Newton. And he discovered the law of universal gravitation. And what it helped do is it helped further explain the heliocentric theory, how objects are attracted to each other, this idea of everything in the earth being governed by gravity. And his book helped to explain the universe working like a giant clock they talk about. And this didn't necessarily go against religion at the time, since he did believe that God was the one who created all this, but it helped further explain the heliocentric theory. And the scientific revolution spread in many ways, and I don't expect you to know every single one of them, but just some examples that we could use, the microscope, the barometer, the two different scales. I know we talked in class today, some of us said, how you were surprised to figure out where the names came from, like the Fahrenheit scale, the Celsius scale, and it kind of goes to giving credit to those people. With medicine, the human body, human dissection. Back then, most of what they knew about the human body, how it worked, was from dissecting animals. It was not seen as appropriate to dissect a human. And so they were able to, by human dissection, to figure out how the human body works. And, very interesting and important medical research was made. And also the first vaccination, giving the cowpox vaccine to try to prevent people from getting smallpox, from Edward Jenner. And chemistry, Boyle's law, oxygen, all these things, the existence of oxygens, elements. What I would say to take from this is just know it was a time period of many discoveries. I don't expect you to know every single one of them, but just to further explain just how quickly things change and how important these discoveries were.